go out and do things like this.
I don't know, man. I think you're kind of a hype.
Yeah, but that is not a good counter to what I just said. He goes, yeah, I don't know, man. How is that? That's not a counter. All right, let's do the Ross Douthat debate. Now, the original title for this video was different. The original title for this video was different. I forget what it was, but now they changed it. There's an accompanying New York Times piece with this as well. For those of you who don't know, Ross Douthat, of course, is a right-winger. He's a conservative, but he's supposed to be like, and he's not even like an anti-Trump conservative, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure he's like, at least like either Trump agnostic or pro-Trump. I can't remember now. But Ross Douthat is a, did you request that they change it? No, I didn't. They do that all the time. They will come out with like a crazy title and then people will get mad at them and then they'll change it. They did that with the style section piece, remember? MAGA body. In any case, oh yeah, the original title was in my How Radical is Hasan Piker? The Twitch star's flirtation with violence. Meet the online star who likes to play with fire. So, I knew going into it that obviously it was going to be like this. It was going to be contentious. But to be fair, Hasan Piker goes on Ross Douthat. Piker has no filter, says Douthat, or at least that's a sympathetic way to describe his marathon Twitch sessions, Twitch podcasts, which cover everything. He's self-acclaimed, blah, 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 blah. All right, whatever. So, like I said, I knew that it was going to be a contentious conversation, but it was going to be a polite one overall. And I hope that I was able to get some of the positions that I have across in a somewhat hostile, somewhat contentious, but very large platform. Because the New York Times, this YouTube video won't do like crazy numbers or whatever, and that doesn't matter. But the New York Times and interviews like this do reach a lot of power brokers, a lot of people who are in positions of power, right? So let's take a look. I think conservatives have a really great way of designing a narrative that makes sense to as broad of an audience as possible.
Everyone is in the business of crafting media narratives,
yes.
Right? And
I wish Democrats were a little bit better at it, to be fair.
Hasan Piker has no filter, or at least that's the generous way to describe his marathon streaming broadcasts.
Fascists need to go to prison permanently. Sig Heiling has one use. You're a Nazi. If Donald Trump is going somewhere, it is certainly not heaven. Israel is an illegal entity, okay?
Which cover everything from the war in Gaza.
It's crazy to me that we treat Israel like this unstoppable force, like they are not human beings that are making these decisions to bomb schools, mosques, hospitals.
To his fitness regimen.
Are you on creatine? Yes, I love creatine. I love creatine.
He's a self-proclaimed Marxist and anti-imperialist.
We here in the United States of America live under the comfort of being a part of the labor aristocracy.
Who's been hopefully called the left's answer to Joe Rogan, and who's compared himself to Rush Limbaugh. And he keeps getting suspended from his platform, Twitch, for language that he calls hyperbolic and other people call incitement.
Is this person calling for the death of a U.S. senator? Of course not. Hello. If you're watching this, that means I just got banned.
Is he the future of the left? Or is he just another example of how living on the internet drives everyone insane? Hasan Piker, welcome to Interesting Times.
We are living in some interesting times, considering that it is you, Ross Douthat, who is interviewing me for the New York Times. I feel like that's very interesting.
Who else would it be, man? This is a show. This is a place for the interesting perspectives of our moment.
Did you hear this intro? Yeah. No, I didn't hear this intro. It was new.
Oh. I think that's what you represent, and we're gonna get into that. We're gonna talk about the Hasan Piker worldview. We're gonna talk about debates about political violence. But I thought we should start because I know what you do. I'm very tech savvy. Obviously, I'm very online. I understand the internet, but there may be some listeners and viewers who don't know what a Twitch streamer is. So I want you to tell me what a Twitch streamer is.
Yeah, Twitch streamers broadly, for the most part, play video games. I'm a little bit unique to the space because I cover politics. I do
news and political commentary for the most part. I do lifestyle stuff as well, and I do the regular things that Twitch streamers do on the side, but that's secondary. But Twitch is basically a live streaming platform. So for the boomers that read the New York Times, I would say it's like YouTube, but it's always live. It's like just live stream YouTube. That's it.
Right. So when I make a podcast, I come into this beautiful, wonderful studio and I sit down and it's like a self-contained thing, but then it's edited and cut up and, you know, turned into the product. Right. But when you sit down, you go for 7 hours? Like what?
If you ask my audience now, they'll say half day Hasi, and they'll say 7 hours, which is a joke. But yeah, I used to do it for 8 to 10 hours every day, but
you've cut back.
I'm 34 now.
Yeah.
So I lowered it to 7.
Okay. And you're doing it after we record this, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. I go 7 days a week as well. Every
Sunday. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think if someone, you know, they can see you right now with the mic and the background, right? But if someone who wasn't familiar with this sort of dropped into the stream, they'd see other stuff on screen, right?
Yeah.
So what would they see? What do you share the screen with?
Normally, at any given moment, if you tune in, you can either see me full screen like this, just doing direct-to-camera commentary, or most likely reading an article, criticizing it piece by piece. And also, sometimes I offer commentary over media from TV channels as well. And it's a broad spectrum of political ideology.
And you're also talking to people who are talking to you, though, right?
So there are tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of concurrent live viewers that are in my chat. So we broadly call it chat. They're on the side of the screen. You can see it as well. It's just constantly going up and down like it's the Matrix, right? Because it's a constant flow of thoughts. And I don't know exactly how I figured this out. Maybe it's my ADHD, but I have been able to somehow offer commentary that people consider compelling, while simultaneously browsing through.
And you're responding. Somebody writes a...
Why is he infantilizing you? No. This part is actually pretty good. So what he's doing here for like the first, I would say like 15 minutes to 20 minutes is explaining what I do to a media executive that's like 60 years old. Okay? Because you have to remember, like, for you, this is every day. Of course you know what I do. But for a person that reads the New York Times and is familiar with Ross Douthat, that person has no clue what I do. They don't know what Twitch is. They don't know anything. And the reason why he's actually giving this backstory, and it's the right thing to do for the record, but the reason why he's giving this backstory here is because he's going to then at least give me like an honest shake. Because he's going to obviously criticize me, but he wants to make sure that it is contextually appropriate. Because if he just like came into it and said, you've said this and you've said that, then we would have to go back and forth on like, well, it's a long, the medium requires you to talk endlessly for 7 hours with like constant feedback, and a lot gets lost in the sauce, a lot gets lost in the messaging, all this stuff. Instead of doing that, he's basically explaining to people exactly what this is.
But
he's also belittling a little bit. No, I don't even think so. I think that's just the tone he takes. Because the reality of the matter is, if Ross Douthat wanted to belittle someone like myself, he just wouldn't do this at all. He would just write an article. I think what he wanted to do instead was not to belittle me, but to present me as somewhat of a dangerous figure in American politics. Because I do think he considers me to be somewhat of a dangerous figure in American politics. The other side of it, the belittling side of it, was when he actually, like that guy was just saying in the chat, the belittling side of it comes from like, oh, well, you live in a nice mansion. Like, you don't want violent, revolutionary violence to come down your doorstep. Like, not understanding that, like, yeah, I don't want that in general. Like, I understand that violence is a constant presence in politics, but like my advocacy revolves around reform. Anyway, let's continue.
that's stupid, Hasan, because of this. And you're like, no, gremlin user 47.
Exactly.
I'm brilliant. You say something, right?
Well, I wouldn't. I don't know if I would say that.
No.
But sometimes it's complementary information that's coming in. So it's almost like a hive mind that can quickly extract and find information all around the internet. And sometimes it's contentious, where people come in and they're right-wingers, or they come in and they're liberals who disagree with me on something, and they'll be like, this is wrong, here is why you're wrong. And then there's like a very quick, spirited debate. And sometimes it can even get a little heated. So the way I've always described what I do is that I'm basically like Rush Limbaugh, but for Zoomers. So it's almost like AM radio in the spirit of like conservative commentary. But obviously, I think I have a higher standard for the veracity of the information that I'm looking at, because a big part of what I do, I think, especially in this age on the internet, is sift through the misinformation. So a big part of what I do is also just like going through all of that and in real time, and also trying to instill some sense of media literacy in the audience. So I explain it as I'm holding your hand through the journey of reading the news.
Do you take a bathroom break? Like, what's your...
I do.
How many bathroom breaks do you take?
I don't know, but my there are some people in the community that time my bathroom breaks, and I think so. It can range anywhere from.
Well, I don't need to know how long the bathroom breaks are. Actually,
the bathroom breaks range from 22 seconds to sometimes a minute and 10. But I'm away from the screen for a brief moment.
Yep.
And oftentimes I'll just have like the video running, like the live video feed running. And I'll stay tuned to it, so I'm not like missing anything. I'll have my father, who comes and stays with me over extended periods of time, make me a meal, and I'll eat that on camera as well. Because I'm live for 7 hours a day.
Right.
I eat at the same time every single day. I have a very strict regimen.
And so like, how does your body feel? So after I podcast, this is, too much confession, but it's like I'm kind of exhausted in a way that is not the case if you sit down and write a column, I assure you, right? Like, it's a physical experience to talk to someone or interview them in a way that I didn't expect before I got into this business, right? And most of the time, you do have guests, but most of the time you're not doing interviews, but you are arguing with people in real time, right? Like, are you just spent at the end of the 7 hours, or do you like go off and exercise? Like, what is the lifestyle?
The lifestyle that your paper's style section actually documented was
I read that piece.
Yeah. So it was quite the controversial title for that piece that everybody seemingly got mad at. But you're absolutely correct.
Wait, what was the title? What was the title?
I think it was a progressive mind and a MAGA body or something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it depletes my social battery unlike anything else that I've ever done. After the end of like a 7, 8, 10-hour broadcast, I do oftentimes feel the need to just like kind of unwind, and I have a hard time just like talking to people
I can
in the
imagine.
immediate aftermath of that, because the way I see it, like, you're constantly on. You have to be entertaining every single second of the 8-hour broadcast. Like, you can't have dead air. You have to be constantly entertaining people, or constantly trying to educate people. So there are some difficulties in that. You're also constantly online, and in order not to feel super isolated and super sheltered from how regular people operate and how they feel, I always find that I ground myself basically by being around what I like to call normies or civilians. And I spend most of my time offline, directly outside, going to public parks, hanging out with my friends, and also working out is a big part of this as well, obviously.
Well, you can't have the MAGA body if you aren't working out, right?
Yeah,
that's what they tell me. I haven't put it to the test yet, but so you mentioned you're 34, right? So you're too old. You're too old to go for 9 or 10 hours. You have to go for 7 hours. You don't have a family, right? You're not married.
No.
Are you going to be doing this at 50? At my age of 45, the ancient years?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. The reason why I said that is because like I've designed everything in my life so that I can continue doing this. This is what I'm good at. This is the only thing I'm good at.
Well, you've designed it, but like not to play the social conservative advice giver, right? But like, do you want to have kids? Like,
I do, yeah.
Okay, but you might have to redesign your life someday.
Yeah.
Fit the kid in. I mean,
fit
the kids in. Well, there might be an issue, but yeah. All right, let's.
No, I meant like there is no issue with scaling back on certain aspects of my life, is what I mean.
Right. So the weekends could free up someday.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
For sure.
All right. Let's talk about the cause then. What you're fighting for. Give me the Hasan Piker worldview. What do you believe?
I believe that the United States of America is a profoundly wealthy nation. It's the wealthiest nation on earth right now. And therefore, it could be doing right by all of the people that are in the United States of America, and yet it refuses to do so. And I want to, through a system of at first modest social democratic reforms, basically claw back autonomy for the everyday person, and hopefully give them more of a voice in their workplace and also in the political process as well, and slowly but surely yield more egalitarian outcomes. On the global dominance side, I think that we should significantly scale back imperialism and the endless wars that we engage in, and focus on helping people in this country, and even focus on helping people in other countries, but in a meaningful way, not in a way where we change their own internal governance structures aggressively and sometimes directly through intervention and by force.
Okay. So situate that narrative relative to actual democratic politicians and activists and so on, right? Like, are you where Bernie Sanders is and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are? Or are you someone who's saying that's a good start, but fundamentally, we want to be democratic socialists, but with an emphasis on the socialism? Like, how far do you want to take the transformation of America?
Okay. So it's not just the transformation of America. I think it's the transformation of global politics in its entirety. I think that capitalism was an evolution away from feudalism and monarchies, and I think it was a fantastic evolution away from that structure. And liberal capitalist democracies, I think, for a very long time presented this wonderful new evolution. But I think it's time for an alternative vision to take place, considering that the tremendous amount of bloodshed that keeps propping up this system continues. And I feel like we have an opportunity to move away from this, especially at a time when liberalism is demonstrably failing. And we are seeing, even as Cass Sunstein recognizes, illiberals that are taking advantage of this situation. Now, of course, he would probably consider me to be illiberal in some respects.
Well, we don't have to say illiberal. Let's say post-liberal, right? So you've got people on the right who would call themselves post-liberal. You've got religious post-liberals. You've got the Curtis Yarvin. We're going to have a Silicon Valley king post-liberal, right? So you're a left post-liberal. I think that's fair. But
yes, I wouldn't say I'm a liberal, yeah.
Right, you're post, right? So you want something after.
I agree with everything you said about your mission, but holy wordy answer, man. For newbies to the channel sound like Hakeem Jeffries speak. Brother, I'm talking to the New York Times. I'm talking to Ross Douthat. I have to be very careful with the words I'm choosing. You will see exactly why I have to be very careful with the words I'm choosing, okay?
Liberalism was good for a while, but it's generated too many inequalities. It's too harsh on the world. But what is the alternative? Is it Marxist? Is it essentially deeper and more profound government management of the economy? What are we talking about?
I think I don't have the perfect solution for this, and this is something that I readily admit, but I think moving in the direction of socialism would be a wonderful start. And the reason why I say that is because, as you mentioned, like a lot of the post-liberal conversations almost always revolve around unifying strength in the hands of one singular figure or one person, going back to a neo-feudalist or like a
aristocratic
crypto monarch structure that Curtis Yarvin advocates for. What I'm advocating for is more democracy, principled democracy, not even in the anarchist sense where everything has to be handled with, or all unjustifiable hierarchies must be abolished through direct participation, but at least like having a more democratic process and getting people more involved, starting at the point of commodity production and then moving all the way to political participation.
I want to talk in a minute about sort of how you developed this worldview and your background, but I want to pause on that idea of sort of democratic change, right? Is all effective change democratic? Or, the thing that the original post-liberal Marxists tended to believe, right, was that, there are certain things you can accomplish through a democratic system, but there's also revolutionary moments, right? To be clear, this isn't just a Marxist idea, obviously. This is the United States of America. We're founded on a revolution, right? But, like, what is your view of revolution as a potential transformative force in the world?
All politics, in my worldview, revolves around the distribution of resources and the distribution of power. And a big part of that component is, of course, violence as well. Revolutionary violence, for example. And it just simply means like who gets to do the violence and who gets to be on the receiving end of that violence that we have normalized. Because the systems that we exist under are inherently violent. All political systems are. It's just more so about redirecting that. And I know violence is such a scary concept in this when we're discussing in this way, but we're talking about it in an academic context. But basically, the idea is that
why did you only stream outside for like 2 hours, Lamar? You could have watched your own interview any other day. What do you want me to do, man? I had other news to cover. Let me do what I'm doing. Okay, you do what you're doing.
Instead of having a system that currently benefits the very few, I want a system that benefits as many people as possible, that has more, like I said, egalitarian outcomes.
Did it not seem like he just wanted you arrested? A little bit. I jokingly said that this is Ross Douthat very gently nudging the administration to arrest me in the aftermath of this interview.
And the current system, as you said, uses violence. And yeah, all political systems are about the monopoly of force in the end, right? But you use the phrase redirect violence. What does it mean to say we need to redirect violence?
I mean, first of all, I abhor violence. Let's just start there, right? But violence in this abstract concept would be equivalent to the structural violence of poverty, for example. So when I'm talking about violence, I want to make it very clear. I'm not talking like go out, take up arms, and like start shooting people, right? I'm talking about the structural violence of poverty. Redirecting that in the same way would be the structural violence of equity.
Right. Because the structural eradication of unjust wealth. Would that be fair?
That would be a better way to.
So the socialist society does not go out and shoot people.
No, yeah.
Though this has happened in some socialist societies in the past.
Of course.
I should just note. But it goes into you live in LA, right? So it goes into Beverly Hills or something, and it says today the city council has voted to expropriate your.
Dude, I'm convinced of it. He used the Reddit talking points. No, he didn't. He didn't use Reddit talking points. This is Ross Douthat. Hasan is not a revolutionary. He just appreciates violence, and he used a clip from Asman when he half-sourced it from you. No, calm down. Okay, this is the New York Times. They did not source their target. This is not the free press. Okay, all of the snark that you are experiencing from Ross Douthat is coming from him and maybe one of his like producers. Okay, that's not That's homegrown. You guys are crazy. Don't understand. You literally don't understand it. I'm sure he used the asthma clip because like someone in his payroll brought it up. But like I will say, Ross is very good at what he does here. He knows what he's doing, even though I hate it. Yeah, he is setting this up, and you will see in a second. He's setting this up to say your worldview is violent, and I know he's setting it up to say that, and that's precisely why I'm starting the conversation by describing what I mean when we're talking about violence, like the structural forms of violence, because basically poverty is structural violence. Not being able to make rent and then being evicted is structural violence, right? Eviction is a violent process. And the reversal of that process would be seemingly violent for those with the power, those with capital. It would be violent to force the landlords to no longer be able to evict people, for example, or be violently taking away their profit margins, eradicating or shredding their profit margins in its entirety. That would be a different way to examine structural violence in a hypothetical socialist utopia. The IRS collecting taxes, which I think brought up in this conversation eventually, is what libertarians would consider to be the state exercising or enforcing its monopoly of violence by telling you you're going to go to prison if you don't pay the taxes. So when I talk about structural violence of that sort, even the reformist positions that I have that are fairly modest, reformist positions that I have, like increasing taxes, for example, yeah, that will be seen as something that is unimaginably violent for those who are at the highest percentage in the highest tax bracket. The reason why I started this conversation with structural violence, however, is because I know it's going to go back to direct violence, the type of violence that liberals actually see as truly violent, because no one actually recognizes structural violence as like another form of violence. Okay?
Lavish undeserved wealth and return your homes to the people. And that's backed up by police power, so it's violent. But it's not, shooting people against the wall. But like, is that what you mean? That kind of redirection?
A similar structure, I think, like has been attempted or was exhibited in Cuba, and I think it was Fidel Castro himself who personally took back any farmland from his own family members that went above and beyond what the state had designed. Now, obviously, this is a terrifying concept for a lot of people. So this is so far out in the future.
Yep. Right.
Yeah, this is so far out in the future for even someone like myself that like I don't even see the necessity of arguing on how this would work, because I'm more invested in, especially in the short term, getting socialized medicine, like getting universal health care, getting free schooling, all the way up to the college education, especially for public universities, ensuring that we have some semblance of government competition, if you want to call it that,
right,
that interferes with the regular market to claw back housing prices, for example, by creating public housing, things that exist in other fairly robust social democracies, and things that actually a lot poorer nations have been able to develop. Just good governance.
Okay. But we're having a debate right now about political violence in the U.S., right? So yes, I agree. The expropriation of the property of wealthy Angelenos is abstract, and we can, far in the future, right? But debates about political violence in this moment aren't. And your platform, Twitch, is right now looks like it might be one of the Trump administration's targets in the aftermath of the Kirk shooting. There's been a lot of...
Is he low-key coming at you for living in LA? It's a not-so-subtle jab at, like, you're a fake revolutionary. You live in a nice house. Of course you don't want that. But he fails to comprehend that, like, I want more equitable outcomes for every single person. The example I always use was when people would be like, socialist but as a Porsche. And it's like, if in the future, in Los Angeles, if the only way that we could achieve robust public transit was for me to dump my car into the ocean, I'd be the first to dump my car in the ocean. Okay? That's it. It doesn't matter. I want these outcomes for everyone. And yes, this is consequential for my bottom line as well. But I don't give. But in the interim, the idea that like I have to live like Diogenes is stupid.
About, we're going to go after institutions and organizations that support political radicalism or incite violence. I think Congress is calling CEOs from Discord and Steam and Twitch and Reddit to testify next month.
Yeah.
Why are they doing this? Why is Twitch a target?
I suspect a big part of the reason why Twitch is a target here, even though it was not mentioned in the investigation at all, like there's no evidence that Tyler Robinson, the alleged shooter of Charlie Kirk, was ever on Twitch. He might have been, right? But there's no evidence for it whatsoever. But the reason why they're being called in, I think, is specifically because the administration currently is, in my opinion, perhaps in a very cynical manner, utilizing Charlie Kirk's death as a way to bring about significant clawbacks of the First Amendment, free expression and free organization, free organizing of the political left. And they haven't necessarily made this a secret either. They've gone after Jimmy Kimmel and numerous other cultural figures that conservatives have of petty grievances around, right? And they've done so in a way where even the most vanilla, the most timid assessment of events is enough for the administration to pull the FCC in to demand taking Jimmy Kimmel off the air. And this has created tremendous backlash from even Republicans, as a matter of fact, because a lot of people do love free speech. I love free speech. I come from a country that does not have free speech. I came to the United States of America from Turkey originally, a country that actually does jail political dissidents and journalists quite frequently. And I don't want that to happen here in the United States of America.
Right. But
but that is what they're going towards.
Right. So you have the Jimmy Kimmel controversy as of
yeah. Look, he's like, his position basically is, he doesn't ever fully say it, but his position basically is, yeah, it's really stupid that they went after Jimmy Kimmel. They should have went after you instead. Because you do deserve getting arrested for your speech.
As of this conversation, he's back on the air. But what they're doing with calling in Twitch and so on, like, that's kind of about you, right? Like you are a target.
For sure.
Right. And are you a target? Are you a target just because you say, you're some kind of Marxist who wants to be post-liberal, or is it something else?
I think conservatives have a really great way of designing a narrative that makes sense to as broad of an audience as possible, even though their own setback is oftentimes how hard they go after certain people. But in the grand design of things, if you look at like the Antifa designation as a domestic terror group, for example, if you read the executive order, it makes sense. They're presenting this as this violent leftist organized unit that is like responsible for so much political violence that's taking place. It's of course built up around this hysteria that they expertly craft as a media narrative first and foremost.
Okay,
but then they want to tackle it.
Notice how anytime I start cooking, he goes, okay. And he has to interject. Like, I want to talk about some serious. And he's like, okay, but what about you? He's teasing the idea of you being violent might have more validity than you're leading on as snarky and gross. No, I know that. I knew that going in. I knew that going in. That's why I have to keep steamrolling through it to get to the meat of the matter. Because I also know the environment that I'm in. I'm speaking not to Ross Douthat. I'm speaking to New York Times readers, okay? Which also include, right-wing Republicans and conservatives that are going to see this and be like, wow, this is a dangerous guy. So on the one hand, that's what I'm cognizant of. But also on the other hand, I know that the real thing that Ross Douthat is not interested in talking about because he is a Republican is the fact that the administration is doing that, right? But he wants to legitimize the administration's actions in that direction by simply saying, well, you kind of deserve it, though. So if they do come after you, don't you think you deserve it? And yes, the New York Times readership is liberal, but Ross Douthat is not, or unless you mean liberal in like the actual political theory What were your objectives? Inform and convince them? No, my objectives were to talk to a right-wing figure at the New York Times who was a pretty decent interviewer and get across some of my fears. Get across some of my fears about the Trump administration so that as broad an audience of New York Times readership as possible is also aware. It's the same shit that I do here every day.
Everyone is in the business of crafting media narratives,
yes.
right? And
I wish Democrats were a little bit better at it, to be fair.
The media narrative around Antifa, right, exists at some level of hype, but also some level of reality, because if you lived in Portland, Oregon in the year of our Lord 2020, you had a lot of experiences of political protest and violence that involved people who called themselves Antifa. That was not fake, right? And it's also not fake that you are a provocateur, right? Like they're not, you know, there are plenty of people on Twitch who...
We also will add a second thing onto the back end that I agree with, because like I do agree with being a political provocateur. I don't agree with the Antifa designation, but I agree with being called a political provocateur. So in that vein, like it looks like I'm agreeing with everything he's saying, but I'm actually agreeing with the second half of the statement.
Are, you know, who they're not, who are not highlighted by conservatives, right? I just want to give you one more chance to describe the things about you in your own words that people are going after before I describe them for you.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that we'll get to that point as well. But like I said,
in just a second, we will.
The things that I advocate for are pretty clear. But of course, this is something that conservatives have experienced and have considered cancel culture or like wokeness in particular for quite a bit, where you can just like reframe someone and smear them, especially in the format that I exist in. It's quite simple to take people completely out of context or make it seem as though they are incapable of using metaphor or incapable of being insincere or hyperbolic in moments, right? And so it kind of goes back to the same thing as like Antifa is a serious threat to American stability and order, and it's an organized unit that must be tackled because they're justifying violence against,
And what do they think you
police
are? What
officers
do they think,
and things of that nature?
The equivalent of that would be conservatives saying that you're inciting violence, right?
Yes, I think that is precisely what they're going to try to do. And not just like inciting violence necessarily, but inciting terror, right?
Revolutionary terror, you might say.
Yes, exactly. And I think that is the grand design and the ways in which the conservative apparatus is going to try and stamp out any sort of political discontent, like any sort of political dissent, really. Because that much has been clear to me, where it's not just about people like myself who they can single out and target and say are like, very scary individuals, but it's also Gavin Newsom, right? Like Gavin Newsom will come out and make this symbolic gesture where he has no power over federal agents, but he'll say that in the next year, ICE agents that are conducting ICE operations in California state have to be unmasked when they're doing this, right? And this is, I think it's a fairly reasonable provision, even though it's ultimately symbolic. Having said that, however, the conservative apparatus will point to that as like Gavin Newsom wants to kill ICE agents and dox them. Like that's not the case, right? I mean, that's ridiculous.
All right, so let's make this a little more.
Yeah, he hated every single time I compared myself, every single time I packaged like what the administration is actually doing. He would just get a little annoyed and try to get it back to just me, because his entire framework is like the administration might come after you, and when that happens, it's actually totally just because you're a rabble rouser. Now, of course, obviously he doesn't fully subscribe to that notion, because if he thought I was like a dangerous terrorist, he wouldn't be having a non-contentious conversation or somewhat contentious conversation with me, okay? But he is actively in this conversation trying to separate me from the likes of Jimmy Kimmel and separate me from the likes of Gavin Newsom. But from the administration's perspective, there is no stopping. And that's my point. There is no stopping at Hasanabi Piker, the dangerous radical, because I'm not a dangerous radical to begin with, I think. he might consider me that, but he's also, you know, a pro-life Republican and someone who's very right-wing. Like, I consider him to be a dangerous radical, right? So basically, the goal here is to separate me from the rest of the crop of, like, you know, high-profile liberals that the administration is going after. But unfortunately for him, the administration is going after them even harder than they're going after me, okay? So that's why he keeps getting annoyed. And it's not even that he's annoyed with me. It's more so that he's annoyed with the administration. Did you think you were a moron going into this? He really undermined his own approach by letting you humanize and contextualize these topics before his analysis? No, I think that was fair of him to do so. I don't think he thinks I'm a but I think he thought that I would dance around too much and I wouldn't appear confident in my worldview. Like, I mean, think about it this way. He had a similar conversation with, like, Peter Thiel, for example. He talks to a lot of very powerful people. He talks to a lot of very powerful people who are very confident in their abilities, even if they actually don't have the skill to properly communicate their positions. Peter Thiel is one of those people. And that's why he had, like, a awesome moment with Peter Thiel where he was like, are you the Antichrist? And he's like, or do you want humanity to survive? And he's like, I don't know. I think that's maybe what he thought he could get out of this, potentially. Because I don't think he's, like, a huge fan of mine or anything. So I think he thought, like, even if he was, like, charitable in the beginning, he would be able to cook. But the problem there is twofold. One, while he might consider my worldview to be radical, I don't think it actually is. It might come across as radical if you look at, like, some edge cases or whatever, some clips out of context. But he's not indecent enough to go that hard on that kind of stuff, because that's, like, not the New York Times way. Because if he were to go that hard, then I think even the New York Times audience would be like, doing, like, at a time when Donald Trump is the president and Donald Trump is literally talking about protesters and shit, you're focusing on some, like, random left-wing Twitch streamer that I've never heard of. He would look too insincere. He thought you would spend all your time defending yourself instead of criticizing the admin's fascistic actions. That's also true. But I'm not there to talk about myself. Zohar Mamdani does a very good job with this as well. I haven't followed you for a really long time. Am I missing something? How do they think you're violent? I assume you share the same confusion. Says no. I know exactly where that animosity is coming from. There are clips out there, of course, over the course of tens of thousands of hours that people could point to from many years ago. Or even recently, like when I talked about how Democrats need to be cutthroat in debates. Like, I'm being hyperbolic, but Republicans would clip that to be like, he wants people to people. Like, he wants Nancy Pelosi to take a knife out and, like, unironically, you know, Mike Johnson or some shit. So, like, there are plenty of instances where you can do that to someone like myself, especially. The way I've come to terms with this is that it is virtually impossible. It is virtually impossible for any human being on the planet who speaks to as large an audience as I do, for as long as I have, in a medium where there is constant back and forth communication with haters and whatnot. It is virtually impossible for them to remain infallible, to look like they have never had a moment that can be clipped out of context. It's impossible. No, they're trying to preempt the Dems going the influencer route when people were calling for a leftist Joe Rogan to galvanize young progressives. That too.
Mm-hmm. You are telling a story where it's you and Jimmy Kimmel and Gavin Newsom, right? And you're all targets of the conservative app.
I don't want to ask him if he thinks Alex Jones should be in prison, because I think he would say yes.
Apparatus. Okay, but you're pretty different from Jimmy Kimmel and Gavin Newsom, in part a lot for reasons we were just discussing, right? They're liberals. They're good milquetoast liberals, whatever they may say. And you are more radical. You're post-liberal in some way. You want a different horizon, a different future. But beyond that, you are also willing to push your rhetoric further than they do. Certainly further than Jimmy Kimmel does, right? And I say this, I want to be clear. I have a pretty high tolerance for, let's say, vivid political rhetoric. I came of age as a newspaper columnist in the 2010s when my liberal friends were all saying, like, oh, every time the Tea Party, you know, talks about revolution and taking our country back, they're inciting violence. And now I live in a world where my conservative friends say Gavin Newsom's inciting violence. Anyone who calls Trump a fascist is fighting violence. I think this is
not even a Hasan Piker fan, and I do not understand how people blame him for barely existing leftist bias. You should have gone harder on the cancer of liberalism to the New York Times audience, in my opinion. No, I need the liberals who are reading the paper to be my allies when the administration comes after me. You're wrong. Your analysis is not even controversial for most political science. I do not understand why you get so much hate. You can read books with similar analysis to yours. Yes, because those are books that you read in college, and they're not being blasted on the timeline to hundreds of thousands of young people in America. That's the difference. Like, I'll give you an example. The indigenous the indigenous rights professor at Cornell University, who's Jewish, was recently suspended for teaching a course on Palestine. Okay, the professor is Jewish, and that professor was suspended after, like, you know, there was like a Unit 8200 IDF guy in the class. He was like filming people. He was being disruptive, whatever, right? But that professor initially was targeted by Canary Mission and Richie Torres, okay? Why am I talking about this professor? Because it proves the argument that I'm presenting to you. When Canary Mission actually targeted this professor, I'm going to pull the quote for you real quick, okay? They actually pointed to something that he talked about in his lecture, okay? The thing he said only comes across as offensive to those who are completely not knowledgeable about the issue, about Hamas. This was it. Are you ready? Richie Torres, posting a Canary Mission tweet, says, Eric Chaffetz, who's a Cornell professor, demonizes Israel and lionizes Hamas, treating good as evil and evil as good. He insists Hamas is morally different from Al-Qaeda and ISIS because it does not advocate for universal jihad. It simply seeks to wipe Israel off the map. Chaffetz is untroubled by genocide when the target is the homeland of the Jewish people. Poisonous professors like Chaffetz are poisoning young minds at taxpayer expense. This is the quote. Unlike Al-Qaeda or ISIS, Hamas does not advocate for universal jihad. It is focused solely on the liberation of Palestine from Zionist fundamentalism, in parentheses apartheid, and the end of the state of Israel. November 4th, 2023. Now, nothing that Eric Chaffetz, who is Jewish himself, by the way, said there is actually even remotely offensive. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. It is what you need from college professors. You need honesty and truth from educators in these esteemed institutes of higher learning like Cornell. What he is saying is factually accurate. Okay? This is not an opinion. This is just a fact. He is describing a fact. But to the broader audience, that fact is something that they don't want to hear. Okay? That's a fact that they do not want to hear. So what do? They bastardize that fact. They chop it up, or sometimes directly present that factually accurate statement and go, can you believe this college professor said this? So yes, while certain things might be completely true in an academic context, it can be very dangerous for a much larger audience to hear that scary truth, okay? At least in the eyes of those who are very powerful and have an interest in making sure that the broader audience doesn't hear the truth. So my problem isn't that I'm engaging in like violent rhetoric or whatever. My problem is that I'm saying stuff like this, but oftentimes also using hyperbole, jokes, and making that process as entertaining as possible. And because of that, I'm able to do that to a much larger audience than a college professor could in their own lecture. That's the fear. That's what makes it so crazy for a lot of people. Because if Eric Chaffetz was saying that on a Twitch stream, he'd get yelled at all the same. As a matter of fact, he's getting yelled at for doing it in a lecture that is directly about anti-colonial movements. His lecture is about Hamas. His lecture is about other indigenous movements that have fought against previous forms of empire and contemporary current forms of empire, imperial power. It's the medium that I do it and the way that I do it that makes it very scary for a lot of people. Do you understand? Because before the internet, there was a filter, as Noam Chomsky talks about, right? There was a filter for someone to reach a very broad audience, to reach this massive audience, massive number of people. You could only get there if you were from an aristocratic family or you went to the right schools, you kissed the right asses, and you chose your words very carefully, and you got elevated through the regular process in mainstream news, okay? And therefore, people self-censored in order to get to that level, in order to be in front of, in order to have the privilege of being in front of a massive audience and to be able to influence them. Whether they were going through that process in a newspaper, or whether they were going through that process through a television channel, doesn't matter. But now that the internet exists, you can have even larger audiences than CNN while sitting in a hotel room or while sitting in your own living room. Okay? And you don't have to filter yourself in that same way. But that's what's so scary about what I'm doing. That's what's so worrisome about what I'm doing, because you can't have people being like Israel's a illegal criminal entity that is doing genocide. Because if there weren't more independent voices on the internet, if there wasn't TikTok, there wasn't like people on Twitter and whatnot saying this over and over again, you wouldn't see this level of mass discontent. It's about controlling flows of information. Why do we think TikTok was sold to Larry Ellison? Because the algorithm that was previously controlled by a foreign government was allowing unique thoughts to flourish in that algorithm, allowing thoughts that normally, allowing speech that normally would not ever be heard in front of as broad of an audience as it was being heard on TikTok. If this wasn't so important or so scary for those who want to control flows of information, if they didn't consider this to be dangerous, they wouldn't have sold TikTok. They wouldn't have forced TikTok to be sold to someone who is one of the biggest donors to the IDF, right? Yes, even after the sale, it's still controlled by a foreign government. I know. It's Israel instead of China. I know. Doesn't matter.
I think if you want to call Donald Trump a fascist, you're free to do so. If I want to call you a commie, I'm free to do so. You know?
People do it all the time.
People do it all the time. Yeah. But this is my reading, and I'll let you tell me why I'm wrong in a minute. I think you push further, and I think you like to play with the rhetoric of violence. So like you were suspended from Twitch, I think, for a day.
Still, you are arguing for a process of consolidation that should be normal in a functioning democracy, not calling for anarchy or violence. I know, but his entire purpose here is to say I am actively calling for violence. And if I were to, like when he initially started asking me about like, you know, what my worldview is, he wanted me to say like, no, through a system of violence, we will seize the means of production, or so he could just start talking about how dangerous of a rhetoric it is. And for the record, there are plenty of people who do believe that. And no, that's not dangerous rhetoric either, okay? That's not. Let's be real. That's not actually dangerous rhetoric, partially because it's completely marginal, and partially because of the same exact underlying principle that I mentioned as well, which is structural violence being a constant and permanent part of people's existence. And yes, people resisting against that. I'm Osama. You ain't like us, you loser. What? My point is, there are people who do believe that, and they are either marginal figures, or overall, at most, they're talking about like historic examples that have existed. And the only reason why we see that as like a form of violence, as opposed to like World War II being a form of violence that is like permissible, is because they're on the other side. They're on the opposing side. We're capitalists. It's that simple. If the entire world was socialist and you had a bunch of capitalists living in a socialist government and they were fantasizing about capitalist forms of violence, the socialist government would look at that and go, this is dangerous. This is violent rhetoric. It's that simple. We live in a capitalist country. Of course, any sort of redistributive policies are looked at with tremendous scrutiny. Obviously, that's the reason why people even yell at me when I say we want to give socialized medicine to Americans. Like that is seen as a dangerous prospect, a dangerous proposition for many people.
There was an argument you were having about Medicare fraud, right? And the GOP was going to crack down on Medicare fraud. And you said, well, if they really cared about Medicare fraud or Medicaid fraud, you would kill Rick Scott. This is the Florida Senate.
People always try to paint you as more radical than you actually present yourself on stream for some reason. You don't even really advocate for violent revolution. You make fun of the revolution now, vanguardists, but they always simultaneously call you a dangerous revolutionary, but also a fake LARPer at the same time. Yes. The reason why people present me as a much more violent and much more radical figure than I actually am is because for the current time frame and for the current material realities that we exist under and for the current political realities that we exist under, my rhetoric reaching this many people is dangerous for them. Israel gets to mutilate children with regular frequency every single day. Israel gets to annihilate the Palestinian population. That is not seen as violence because that's the state doing that. Okay? How dare you call that out? But on the other side, if you turn around and say, no, people do have, under international law, a complete legal right and moral responsibility to resist against a genocidal apartheid regime destroying their lives, then you're the violent one.
And it's a reference to the fact that Scott's company paid some huge fines for, they were engaged in some kind of Medicare fraud, right? But you didn't say we should put Rick Scott in jail for Medicare fraud. Right? You said,
if you cared about Medicare fraud or Medicaid fraud, you would kill Rick Scott. Okay? You wouldn't make Rick Scott, former governor of Florida, Rick Scott.
This is not an Asmongold clip. This is from my own YouTube video, chatters.
You wouldn't make him a prominent part of the Republican Party.
Well, this was, for the record, this was in response directly to Mike Johnson. And it is something that I take ownership over. I did apologize for the language that I used instead of saying, like, you know, just you should jail Rick Scott,
right?
Which would have been the most inoffensive. It was a hyperbolic statement that I made, not with like any sort of significant death threat issued to a sitting elected representative. Obviously,
I agree.
And
I don't think you were issuing a death threat. I agree.
Yeah. So, but you're right. That is hyperbolic language for sure, and it's one statement in a grand sea of others that of course gets highlighted through the same outrage machine, and then people demand punishments, and then those punishments do come down, and it causes me to be even more careful with my language. Having said that, given the 10-hour format that I have, there are definitely going to be weak moments where I just like say something without even thinking about what that might come across as.
Yeah. I mean, you do. I read through. You have a lot of content, right? So I'm not going to tell you that I have read through every hour, every transcript. But I feel like I read enough to get a sense of sort of what you mean by hyperbole, right? And it means different things, right? It means like you're talking about landlords and why they're bad. I think you were talking to a landlord friend at the time, right? But you said, let the streets soak in their bleeping red capitalist blood, dude, right? So I
also said in a video game, but to showcase the silliness of the statement in of itself.
Right, okay. So it's like ironic, or is it Marxist revolutionary rhetoric? I just want to bring this to a fine point. There's the great case of Luigi Mangione, right? Who is charged with murdering the CEO.
Unsurprising that this is presented as some kind of advanced level tone policing critique. Yeah, I mean, that is what it is. Why is he talking to you like the school principal? Because that's what's going on. AKA, he read whatever viral conservatives think this guy wants to genocide the whites clips. Guys, it doesn't matter. Those clips are out there. Ross Douthat is probably one of the better formats and one of the better Republican thinkers to address those clips with. Okay, that's it. No way people are saying you lost the debate. No, who the f saying that? Comments don't seem to think that at all. They actually enjoyed the conversation. Dude, I could absolutely eviscerate whatever interlocutor in the marketplace of ideas, and there is going to be a crop of people online who are going to say, dude, he got owned. That's just what they do. Those are the same people who, quite literally, when I made a public statement about not going to TwitchCon out of concern for the safety of others around me, not even myself, but the safety of others around me, literally use that as an opportunity to dunk. Okay? It doesn't matter. You need to understand, like, there's just gonna be people that do that regardless.
Of United Healthcare in broad daylight in New York City. And you're gonna tell me that you've always said that murder is wrong and that Luigi Mangione should not have committed murder. But you've talked a lot about Luigi. And
of course. I think it's one of the most consequential instances of adventurism, which I always will say is wrong because I think it invokes social instability which I think is bad in general to exist under. But what I try to always do, especially with the Luigi Mangione case, is to talk about the concept, for example, of social murder, the notion of our systems that already exist, like the privatization of healthcare and the denial of care that make people infinitely less tolerant than we normally would in a civilized society to an adventurous act of violence, such as the case is with Luigi Mangione.
Who is we?
I'm much more interested in talking about.
Just pause there. That make you're talking, because this is something you've done a bunch, right? You sort of you don't say I love Luigi. You're like, we people are, he's seen as a positive figure. He's for most of America. He says, I'm going to dish out what many Americans have experienced to the figurehead of that pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think like most Americans sympathize with who is the we who looks at shooting United Healthcare CEO and says that's understandable?
I think it's the people online that are not necessarily like card-carrying DSA members or whatnot, but just like
that's Democratic Socialists of America,
aunts,
just for
Yeah. Not the like the DSA guys or the Democratic Socialists of America or Party for Socialism and Liberation, but it's like the Barbers and the Debras, as I like to call it, that live in the Midwest and are truly repulsed by the way that private healthcare operates in this country. And for them, I think the Luigi Mangione case is really unique because Americans do not like political violence, right? Nobody likes it. I mean, this is poll after poll that has shown everyone thinks that obviously murder is wrong. I think murder is wrong. Everyone thinks political violence is wrong. And yet, in the case of Luigi Mangione, a lot of people, I think, had such a deep personal experience with the way that the healthcare system has harmed them in some way that the reaction ultimately was very different than one I had expected. From the moment that, before they even found out who the alleged shooter was, from the moment that people recognized that the victim was the faceless CEO of a healthcare company, everyone immediately understood what the motive was.
Faceless, right?
No, I'm saying like for
most people, the healthcare company had previously been faceless, and now there was a dead man who had a face, right?
Exactly, and I think that was a unique case that needed to be examined, and that's precisely the reason why the media was covering it in the same way as well. The only difference is that, tonally speaking, they were just more so outraged by the reaction in of itself rather than trying to examine why people felt this way. And I think what I try to do in this situation,
I mean, look at this, bro. Look at this. YouGov, December 17th, 2024. Net favorability of Luigi Mangione, 18 to 29-year-olds, plus 9%. 30 to 44-year-olds, minus 1%. I mean, that's crazy. 18 to 44, either as a positive opinion or like 50-50 split on them. Yeah, if people have more financial security, then they have they have less interest in this kind of like dangerously unstable moment. That's it. If people are hopeless about their future, they end up leaning on adventurism. That is my argument. That is the point I'm making. It took people recognizing who the victim's job, not who the victim was, but just what the job was of the CEO or of the person who was shot, for them to immediately know, oh, I know what happened here. Healthcare is such a universal burden on all Americans that they literally understood exactly what was going on and responded the way that they did.
And many others is to explain why people feel this way. Because for them, when their grandparent has cancer and then that treatment is denied or the coverage is denied, even though they're paying these incredibly costly premiums to this healthcare company, they view that as murder. They view that as a tremendous wrong that was done to them. And I seek to address these problems so that there isn't decentralized forms of violence where people make up their own minds and assume that they have the righteous vindication, and they're going to go out and do things like this.
I don't know, man. I think you're kind of a hype man.
Yeah, but that is not a good counter to what I just said, okay? If we're just going ban for ban on just debate, okay, we're talking about this from just the perspective of a debate, okay? I laid it out exactly. I said decentralized forms of violence is a risk. It's a risk for societal collapse because for many people, society is already unwinding. They understand they have universalized this burden of private healthcare, okay? For them, they're like Brian Thompson, for the perspective of the average person, people like Brian Thompson are responsible for a death of a loved one, okay, by denying them coverage. I know he's a cog in the machine, and I know he's not directly responsible for it, but that's precisely how people reflected on it. And of course, I think it's worthy of analysis. And he goes, yeah, I don't know, man. How is that how is that? That's not a counter. I don't know. I think you like it. Okay, well, why did I describe everything then? Check the comments. Everything is negative, and he pinned the one neutral comment. Yeah, I have it right here, by the way. I don't know what he personally, or what the New York Times personally pinned, but the reader picks are cooking them. I'd love to have someone take the most controversial statements that have been espoused by Hasan and contrast that with the inflammatory and insightful language of the mainstream media and the right. I think some folks would be surprised that, compared to some of Kirk's, Limbaugh's, or Carson's, or Poole's, or cowardice statements, he does not have nearly the same level of anger or vitriol that these people speak on. Truly, we live in some interesting times. Especially in the end, Ross comes across as totally out of his depth in a conversation that he's ostensibly leading. Hard to not see this whole exchange being emblematic of the media landscape. The traditional media seems to be operating in an outdated paradigm that stopped in Trump's first term, which was nearly a decade ago now. There's no doubt in my mind that Donald Trump is far more inflammatory than anything this man Hasan Piker can possibly say. And Donald Trump and his disgraceful minions have proven that they will attempt to carry out even every one of their violent and divisive acts in the name of my government. Whatever Mr. Hasan expresses, and I'm not at all familiar with him, I cannot express how disturbing I find the blasé manner in which Mr. Douthat attempts to associate people like me with violent rhetoric wherever it rears his ugly head, especially while he winks away through the disgrace of this administration. He explicitly says he doesn't endorse violence, so strange title. The double standard that the left has to be a paragon of virtue while they say everyone deserves healthcare, food, and a roof over their head is insane. Advocating for policies that end state violence is far less violent than what the right does and says. Hasan has a better grasp of political working class politics and the youth vote than 99.9% of elected Democrats. Now do the version where you investigate most of all political and cultural figures on the right. You don't see permission for violence in Kirk saying that gays should be stoned to death, in Kirk saying that he's willing to accept some gun deaths to maintain American gun culture, in Kirk saying trans people should be lobotomized. This is like people dunking on this Patrick guy who I guess said something like negative about me. You found the original Patrick comment? I'm not MAGA, voted for Harris, but I'll take 10,000 Charlie Kirks over... But I'll take 10,000 Charlie Kirks over 10,000 Hasan Pikers any day of the week. Pikers all over the map, as you'd expect from someone who streams his consciousness 7 hours a day. But there's an unmistakable permission for violence that runs through his interview. Charlie Kirk never did that. Ezra Klein took a lot of grief for complimenting Kirk's style, but I much prefer the one-on-one logical argumentative style over the run-on, formless dialogue with unseen and unheard viewers, peppering him with cash tips that characterizes Piker's whole shtick. By which I mean... Piker was a great interview subject. Nicely done, Mr. Douthat. I'm sure that many of your readers/listeners had no idea who Piker is or what he does, or the way he offers excuses for shocking violence under the banner of socialism and progressivism. And every one of the New York Times readers is like, what the are you talking about? This is ludicrously revisionist about Charlie Kirk's public stances. Things like Islam is the sword of the left is using to slit the throat of America. Do you think that that's a call for his followers to engage in reasoned, measured debate with conflicting viewpoints to allow themselves to be convinced of things? Come off it. Marxists believe in ending the capitalist system just as liberals believe in ending the feudal system. Whether that process is violent or not is ultimately up to the ruling class. Patrick, more Patrick dunks. If you truly... Dude, they went crazy on my boy Patrick, okay? Patrick simply wanted to get a slam in there and be like, this is Hasan guy. Charlie Kirk is so much better than him. And the New York Times readership is eating his ass alive. If you truly believe that Kirk never flirted with permission for violence, then you are very forgetful. Charlie Kirk was very nonchalant about excusing violence. For example, when thugs assaulted store workers and destroyed store property during the Pride Month in 2023, he further encouraged such displays of violence by painting them as shows of force. Literally, tonight we show them that they're the losers. Or when Paul Pelosi was attacked in his own home and Kirk encouraged his followers to bail him out while painting the attacks as karma against the Democrats. Or when he called the biblical passage that calls for the death penalty against homosexuals the perfect rule. Charlie Kirk was not the calm, reasonable, debating type you desperately pretend he was. Bro, if you get this dogpiled this hard by a bunch of Barbaras, Deborahs that are New York Times readers who take the time out to comment on a New York Times article, you gotta unsubscribe from the New York Times. Okay, you're cooked. You're getting, this is like getting dunked on in the Pornhub's comment section. Okay, like they said smoke them. They lined it up. Like, what are we doing? Douthat responds to Piker using the term adventurism. We already covered this. Today on Interesting Times, Ross pushing harder on a streamer from the left than he does when he interviews people on the right with actual power and incite the perpetuate actual violence. Peter Thiel and JD Vance. It's so obvious how we ended up here as a country and continually discouraging that our media continues to hand us the shovels that we use to dig ourselves deeper into a failing state. And even people who are like somewhat neutral to me that don't know who the f I am and are basically like, this is their first introduction to who I am. They basically say this, like, he's a fringe figure. He can have an audience of hundreds of thousands, but think about how tame he is in compared to the American extreme right, or even Rush Limbaugh back in the day. Piker doesn't consider conservatives un-American, doesn't hate them, doesn't want to use the power of the state to literally exterminate them. The reverse simply isn't true. Exactly. I want to literally exterminate their medical debt, dude. That's what I want for conservatives. Conservatives want me deported. I want conservatives' healthcare costs to be deported. That's the difference between me and the average conservative. Now, they can turn around and act as though they're not advocating for violence by simply presenting the Bible. They can be like, oh, the Bible told me it's okay to the gays. That's the Bible. Take it up with the Bible over and over again. I don't sit around and go, look at Das Kapital. Das Kapital told me this. That's not what I'm doing. That's Bart from Idaho, by the way, not a Hasanabi head. He is just fine. In case somebody bothers to understand what he's talking about, just fine. We are living in a baffling time in which a Twitch streamer is held to a higher standard than the President of the United States. I listened very carefully to this whole interview. I couldn't help but notice that every time I was especially compelled by Piker's response to something, which is to say, when I thought Piker was about to take down Douthat's assumption, thesis, argument in an especially powerful and eloquent way, Douthat would interrupt and either redirect or focus on a minute point, in effect derailing the narrative. This is a very smart tactic and one that is difficult to combat. It requires the interviewee to have 100% presence of mind and not be knocked off their feet. It's also a cheap tactic, understandable but cheap. Piker at moments overcame it by talking over Douthat's interruptions, but obviously Douthat had the home team advantage. To everyone's credit, though, I thought this was a great conversation, and I would be super supportive of more of this. The two sides need to keep talking to each other in this way instead of staying in echo chambers. Check this one. Hasan Piker has turned his reckless rhetoric into a full-time job. He's the guy who once said America deserves 9/11. Compared Hamas, okay, this guy is this has to be like a Sex Pestini fan, right? I don't think the average New York Times reader is that tuned into, you know, this has got to be like a Ethan Kleiner or like a Asmongold fan or like a Sex Pestini. The lone. Check the YouTube comments. He pinned the one neutral comment. Everyone else is cooking him. Oh, on YouTube he pinned it. Love the podcast. Quickly becoming the best show. Ross tries to bait Hasan and call for an act of violence. Hasan chuckles. Love the podcast. Quickly becoming the best show. Ross tries to bait Hasan and call for an act of violence. Hasan chuckles. How did growing up in the Middle East radicalize you? This guy's a real piece of work. Nice to see a successful journalist sitting down with an up-and-comer like Ross. This reminds me of why I stopped reading the New York Times in the first place. It's hard to tell if Ross is intentionally misrepresenting Hasan with the explicit intent to deceptively warp his audience's perception, or his worldview is so distorted that he genuinely thinks what he said is true. I don't know which is worse. Insane interview. Ross putting words in Hasan's mouth and basically saying, I don't believe you when you say you don't advocate for violence is embarrassing. Hasan, people are being murdered by health insurance companies because they refuse to provide payment for curable illnesses, diseases, etc. That is structural violence. Ross, I don't know, man. I think you're hyping up the violence. That literally just happened. We just paused it right there. Like literally. That is verbatim a summary of the last 5 minutes of me like thoughtfully trying to describe to him, dude hated you before the interview, now hates you even more after reading those comments. No, I think like this'll work well for him because he got his point across, and not only that, but also he not only did he get his point across, but then also on top of that, he was able to. This will do good numbers. Like he gets good engagement out of this. So I don't think these guys care about that kind of stuff.
Like yes, I agree. You're doing analysis, and sometimes the analysis people would have celebrated Luigi Mangione, obviously, without you, Hasan Piker, talking about him all the time, right? But I listen to the way you talk about him. Like, you're fascinated by him, too. You're participating in the fascination, and you're doing a thing where you're like, well, you know, I'm not saying violence is good, but you've got to understand that there's other forms of violence in society besides this one, and people who like Mangione They're saying this violence maybe isn't as bad as that kind of violence. And this just seems to me like you're not the guy who starts the revolution, but you're the violence appreciator. That's sort of how I feel about your Mangione coverage. You're out there. You're appreciating.
I wouldn't say that that's fair.
It's like, okay, tell me why it's not fair.
But the reason why I'm saying I wouldn't say that that's fair is because, like, I do make it obviously very clear that, and I refer to this over and over again, adventurism and people taking matters into their own hands is a mere reaction to the social contract unwinding in real time in front of us. I don't think this is a good thing. I want to make sure that we have a system that helps everyone. And a part of that is creating the same social stability that existed. Now, you can do that by force, by stamping out dissent and moving in the direction of the Trump administration, or you can try and do that by addressing some of these inequities that exist that do actually harm a lot of people, right? Because I don't think you disagree with my assessment that systems are inherently violent, no matter which way they go, and that, I assume you understand what I mean when I say, like, the social murder of tens of thousands of Americans in the process of having their healthcare coverage denied. Like, it must interest you as well, right? Because it interests certainly people at CNN and many other mainstream outlets, like, why people are doing this. But their reflection on it is,
I think it's 100% the case that people had certain people.
You want to know why this was a lost cause for Ross? Because I feel like even Elizabeth Warren went on television after, and everyone was like, why are people celebrating Luigi Mangione? We can't understand it. And even Elizabeth Warren was like, why do you think? Like, look at the healthcare system. Like, what do you think is going on in the American healthcare system when people have their care coverage denied? Like, it's over at that point. Like, what do you expect? That's Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren is never going to say some shit like that.
People had terrible experiences with the health insurance bureaucracy.
Also, apparently, Ross Douthat defended Pinochet in his Harvard days. And I did not know that, but I mean, that does track. I wonder if did I bring up Pinochet at all in this conversation? Because it did go into numerous directions at times.
Had a reaction to.
I didn't know that he defended Pinochet, but it does make sense.
That is like what you described. I think that's absolutely real, and it says something about the way the system works in America. Yeah. On the other hand, I also think, and again, because I'm not a socialist utopian, right? I think that there is not this magical alternative where, if we only didn't have nasty politicians who love the rich imposing austerity, everyone would get all the care that they want. I don't think that world exists. I have a lot of personally negative experiences with the American healthcare system. I technically still have chronic Lyme disease, which is a disease that officially doesn't exist. It definitely exists. And I've known a lot of people in that world who have a very specific version of the kind of anger you're describing that's directed towards the medical establishment and how it interacts with insurance companies. And, these are people who've had their lives ruined by this illness that the system does not effectively cover or treat. But it's really important, right, as a society, that if one of my friends who had chronic Lyme disease went out and killed someone who they felt was involved in denying them treatment, and maybe was, right, that you wouldn't that it would be irresponsible for me to do a podcast and be like, man, that person looks badass. I think that would be irresponsible, even if I was appreciating something real. And that's where I think it's not you saying it's really interesting how people have this reaction to it is what I'm challenging or questioning. It's the extent to which, again, you're like, oh, he's an adventurer. It's the propaganda of the deed.
He's not an adventurer. He's an adventurist. I think he understands what that means, by the way, because he says propaganda of the deed, so he gets it. Of course, propaganda of the deed would be a more positive association with that sort of thing, whereas adventurism is the Marxist interpretation, which is a negative association with that sort of thing. So obviously, as a Harvard-educated guy, I think he knows I think he understands that.
Man, well, okay, yeah, but a society that has those adventurers is going to be in a lot of trouble pretty quick.
I agree. I don't disagree with you on this. I think it's a reflection of the very social fabric that keeps us together and keeps us stable.
According to Ross, the proper course of action to respond to Luigi Mangione is to keep watching it happen and do absolutely nothing other than look at each instance of violence and go, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad, in perpetuity. You, on the other hand, can go, maybe we can put an end to it, perhaps. Yeah. I mean, it's the same with, like, gun violence. It's the same with gun violence. Like, I feel like I lost my mind a long time ago, constantly trying to understand, like, constantly trying to make sense of the senseless violence that exists in America. Okay? Where I was just like, what are we doing? Like, this is insane. Please, some sensible legislation, please. Can we have some sensible legislation, please? Nope. It just doesn't make any sense.
In real time. America is a very violent country, right? But we have systematized this violence and we have normalized it. And inevitably, that violence has also come back to the domestic front, where there's unlimited bloodshed happening at schools. I mean, Charlie Kirk's assassination was the 46th school shooting, technically, a shooting that happened at a school. And then the 47th happened only an hour later in Colorado. And our reflection on these sorts of events is that because it's so normalized, because the system must continue, because there are numerous different interests at play here, specifically gun manufacturers, for example, a very important part of our domestic manufacturing industry.
America is an extreme
and a big part of American culture.
America is an extremely libertarian, personal liberties devoted society in ways that have right-wing connotations, like lots of gun ownership, and left-wing connotations too. But yes, go on.
Certainly. And what I'm trying to say is that in the absence of any sort of significant initiative to claw back some of that, to have some kind of reasonable policy that will say, all right, guys, like, we all like guns. I like guns. I like shooting guns, right? I do not have any sort of gun culture in my development.
You picked it up.
Began my journey of understanding guns because I was writing about gun control, and I was like, I need to learn about this stuff. But having said that, I still believe that there needs to be reasonable gun safety, reasonable gun control. This is not a call to action to say, like, oh, it's awesome that, like, school shootings are happening, or it's awesome that political assassinations are taking place left and right.
No, but nobody. But this is the difference. And
but I promise say that it's no longer just like random school children that are being killed, is what I mean. The only reason why this is becoming a more significant, more consequential problem in the eyes of many people in the media is because it's no longer people that we can just kind of see as collateral damage and, like, consider to be invisible.
I don't think that's right. First of all, I think that the media has
now we start the debate a little bit.
A lot of coverage to school shootings. I think it would be strange to say that the media has ignored that issue in any way, shape, or form.
Oh no, I think wasn't saying that they ignore it.
But I think the line, you're like, the reason people are upset in this case, the reason that people are upset in this particular case, right, is that when school shootings happen, right, there is, except in very online communities, there is not valorization of the school shooters. Nobody calls a school shooter an adventurer, right? And the people, obviously we don't want to live in a world with school shootings, but we especially don't want to live in a world where it seems like people who are sort of in the public scrum, like you, right, are sort of appreciating violence. Like, if I'm pro-life. I think abortion is a form of murder. I think if somebody killed an abortionist and I went in the New York Times the next day and tried to write something that was in the vein of what you said about Mangione, and
the difference is abortion is not murder. Okay, that's the difference, and he knows it's not murder. Whereas someone who is dying from a disease that they could prevent, but because it's paywalled, that is seen as actual murder. Having said that, there are plenty of right-wing commentators who have unironically advocated to directly murder doctors. The most famous example of this, of course, is Bill O'Reilly, which I did bring up. I don't know if they actually is in the cut here. I said Bill O'Reilly quite literally did that with a doctor, Dr. Tiller. He called him Tiller the baby killer, and then one of his fans went to the church that he was at and shot and killed him.
I concede writing and talking are different, right? But if I'd done that, it wouldn't be published, and I might be fired. Not as a violation of my free speech rights, but because I would be crossing a line of, again, not endorsement, but even just appreciation, like the appreciation of the violent act. I think there's a taboo around that for a reason, and you like pushing at that taboo. I just think that's what you like to do.
I don't, it's not something that I like to do necessarily, but I want to examine the contradictions of even what you just said, right? You say abortion is murder. I obviously don't agree with that. I'm pro-choice. I think it's a matter of bodily autonomy, and the government shouldn't interfere in this between a medical professional and a woman. Having said that, you get to argue about women's bodily autonomy being potentially removed by making the argument through the systematized version of violence. Because I think, as you would probably also recognize, abortion restrictions have come down in numerous states since the decision of Roe v. Wade was overturned. And in the process, women have found themselves in this unique predicament where they can't even get their ectopic pregnancies dealt with because their medical professionals are worried about potential prosecution. This has led to a lot of pain and a lot of torment, and maybe even in some instances, death. When you argue on behalf of the pro-life position, you don't have to say, like Bill O'Reilly did, Tiller the baby killer, and then someone goes out and actually shoots a doctor. You can simply say, I'm not putting words in your mouth. I don't know what your position is on or your advocacy around abortion, but someone of this mindset can easily just advocate for the harm that is done to millions of Americans, potentially, without uttering a single word that could be considered remotely violent by the broadest subsects of American society.
Right. So you're right.
This is the
right. No,
That is the reason why I wanted to have this conversation. The asymmetry that exists with the ways in which the right get to dominate the narrative, dominate violent rhetoric, and say violent shit with regular frequency. Charlie Kirk was a great example of this. I even brought up Ben Shapiro earlier on in the conversation. They did cut that part out, I'm pretty sure, because I said this is how Ben Shapiro gets away with being violent. He never says go out and kill black people. He says, in a system where there is disproportionate targeting of black people in the hands of the police, where the state has a monopoly on violence, he says, I want more targeting. I want more police targeting in black communities because they're poor and because they're violent communities that need to be targeted. He doesn't have to say that these are violent thugs, even though he does from time to time, or he doesn't have to directly do a call to action in the same vein that like a Klansman does. He can just lean on the pre-existing violent constructs. That's what I said about Ben Shapiro in this conversation. I don't know if they kept it, because that was the main point that I was trying to put forward. That is my main proposition. My argument is right-wingers, of course, can sit around and say, I abhor political violence, while they demand a metric ton of it. They demand it every day. And when people respond to that now and say that's fascist, because that is the most like understandable, like most understood form of serialized, systematized violence is fascism. It's the type of violent systems that we here in America, luckily right now we're still anti-fascist somewhat, look at and say that's violent. Okay, we look at that and we say, that's violent, that's fascist. And Republicans now want to make it illegal to even say that. And when Ross Douthat comes after people like myself, he's actually leaning into that censorship agenda as well.
This is the uneven dynamic is what I'm trying to explain.
I understand your argument, but your strategy for your argument is that effectively advocacy for policies that cause harm, economic harm, or physical harm, could itself in this case, right? But we were talking about economic harm earlier, so both apply.
Economic harm
right?
also leads to physical harm as well. But
that constitutes a form of, could be argued to constitute a form of incitement, right?
Yes, that's precisely what you're saying,
right?
Yeah, and that's actually the argument with policing,
right? But so
policing is a necessary institution.
But then why
people can just point to it and demand more of it? But that in that demand, they're technically demanding more of the unreasonable outcomes and the unjustifiable outcomes of policing that lead to, for example, the death of George Floyd, right?
Right,
but or numerous other cases.
But this analogy is itself part of why people think you are normalizing the things that are taboo, which again would include right-wing forms of violence. But if your theory is all of these things are incitement, if you support...
He's about to say you're a hypocrite, but he doesn't understand you have your own moral compass. Yeah, I mean, I think he's like gearing up to be like, well, that's what you do. Like, you're saying that, right-wingers are doing this. That's what you do. And I'm saying, yeah, my job is to describe that is wrong. That's what I'm doing. That's why I think it was important that I laid out initially that, like, politics is about the distribution of resources and power. And one of the key components of the distribution of power is the distribution of violence. Like, who gets to do it? Who gets to be on the receiving end of violence? So, like, in that sense, it is a constant. Yikes, this dude. Yeah, right-wingers do that for police brutality. I say it is unacceptable. Those systems of violence are unacceptable. And one of the undesirable yet inevitable outcomes of such a violent structure is going to be violent resistance. Sometimes that violent resistance is going to be just. Sometimes that violent resistance is going to be unjust. But the very fact that it's not always just in terms of retaliatory violence is the reason why we must solve these issues at the legislative level. That's it. Or at least deal with it in a more organized fashion, in a more directional fashion. That's my argument.
Putting more people in jail, that's incitement. If you support, border security, that's incitement. It's incitement all the...
Political violence does not protect the country, protect the speech in the country that you live. What? First of all, the talking about political violence is a vague term. If you're talking about like actual like killing people, yeah, that's illegal. But if you're talking about like political rhetoric that could be potentially inciting violence or whatever, that is such a vague and nondescript way to describe anything that, yes, free speech would in most circumstances until recently would have kicked in and said, no, you can't prosecute that shit at all.
Way down. Like, you're basically saying the person who incites violence against a politician is in the same position as the person who supports border security. And that seems like an argument that lends itself to encouraging people to commit political violence, because you're saying, oh, it's all normal already. What's a little more? What's one more act of incitement in a world of incitement? You're just normalizing it when you make that argument.
Yeah, my argument is that I'm not normalizing it. It's already normal. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to be normal. I want it to be abnormal. I want people to actually take a serious look at the violent structures that already exist, that from the point of the recipient is already experienced as like a direct form of violence. But do you understand the broader point that I tried to arrive at in these conversations, for the record, which of course lend themselves so perfectly to quippy clips to just make it seem as though, this is a person that is very clearly inciting a certain thing. Or do you think I'm just like dancing around the issue? You can be honest.
I think that I'll be honest. I think there's a reason that certain kinds of Marxism and socialist radicalism, when they...
You ain't challenging me? Come on live. It will be. What the Are you trying to go meat for meat? What's this? Are you trying to go sword fighting?
Take power or trying to come to power tend to resort to violence, and it is inherent in the argument that you've made. I'm not saying it's an argument that doesn't have a certain power. If it didn't have a certain power, lots of people wouldn't have believed in it, right? There is an inherent violence in the use of state power. There is an inherent coercion in all kinds of policies, including policies that I support, right? Mm-hmm. I support restrictions on drugs, right? That probably you do not. that absolutely involve coercion. I believe in restrictions on bodily autonomy enforced by state power that uses violence. I believe in that.
Yeah.
I understand that someone can say, as as a radical on the left, this violence exists and we want to redirect the violence. And do I think that you, Hasan Piker, prosperous media personality in Los Angeles, are enthusiastic about, the expropriation of wealth and punitive violence by communist death squads? I don't think you are. But I think that the reason you have strong taboos against sort of, about,
I will say what I'm enthusiastic
to prevent that slope from slipping in that way.
Okay, so I am enthusiastic about the expropriation of wealth for people such as myself as well, in the form of taxation, though. And that's basically the grand design that I have.
Right now, though, no one's going to deplatform you, right? Twitch is not going to suspend you for saying that you want to raise taxes on the rich and use the force of the state to take. But what do you think? Like, do you think it was reasonable for Twitch to suspend you for a day for talking about killing Rick Scott? Like, what are the obligations, I guess, I'm asking, of...
What's so crazy about this also is, like, he plays fast and loose with the killing of Rick Scott thing, because he also, like, early on recognizes that it's not a death threat, right? Like, he very quickly starts the conversation by being like, it's not a death threat. We both know it. And then he just still kind of brings that back in this way, where it's like, what am I supposed to do? Like, literally talk about that endlessly? I can't. I have to move on.
Of platforms with this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think it's understandable that Twitch did that, which is why I apologize for the use of my language as well. Like I said, there are certainly instances where it's an emotionally charged conversation, or I'm being careless, and it comes across it reaches an unintended audience that sees it as in this like super short format in a very negative way. It's unfortunately a byproduct of the medium that I'm in.
But you're okay.
Real-time discourse happening with random anonymous accounts.
But you're okay with some kind of taboo maintenance here.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
In order for normal discourse to flourish, obviously, some kind of terms of service need to be implemented. Like a direct call to violence is, of course, going to be considered unacceptable. I totally understand that. Even if it's like being made in jest, or even if it's like being misunderstood in that moment without the appropriate context.
Yeah.
Having said that, however, if we're talking about like broader things, and we didn't really get to talk about this a lot, but a deplatforming initiative has taken place on Twitch and on numerous other platforms, mostly championed by the ADL and some other actors as well, because of my consistent anti-Zionist advocacy. I am an avowed anti-Zionist. I openly say it. I have also spent all of my professional career combating anti-Semitism, which has grown in this country as well. And yet, a lot of these organizations, I think, and a lot of people have falsely maligned and smeared me as an anti-Semite, despite my advocacy against anti-Semitism.
So this brings us to the last area I want to talk about.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a few times growing up in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Just talk about for a minute your background in the Middle East and how it shaped your politics. How it radicalized you might be a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I have, I think, a very different opinion about American foreign policy than the average American has, due to the fact that I didn't grow up in America. I had more proximity or a closeness to, I guess, the recipient of American violence and American intervention, being someone who grew up in Turkey. And
yes, bro, Middle East is a wild way to talk about it, but it is what it is. Come on, just move
therefore,
on.
My starting position is very different to the way that like the American world police narrative was designed in the United States of America, admonishing its enemies, making them seem as though they're barbaric and deserving of like some kind of direct military intervention. These are things that I obviously considered to be not only wrong, but also incredibly consequential. This kind of sentiment was incredibly consequential for people who had to live in these countries and had to be victims to boots on the ground military warfare and even like the drone wars that greatly escalated under Obama.
What do you think about the government of Turkey?
I am not a fan of the government of Turkey, and I've written extensively about my criticisms of the government of Turkey, and that's part of the reason why I can't really go back to Turkey, even though my whole family lives there, out of fear that I might be jailed. And I don't think the Trump administration would demand my return as an American citizen.
I'm curious how you think about how left-wing politics and Middle Eastern culture and Islamic politics fit together. And I understand you're not a Muslim. You don't consider yourself a Muslim and so on, right?
But I say I'm a Muslim.
But you're culturally
because,
right. You're
I'm culturally Muslim in the same way like
Muslim.
many secular Jews are
right.
Jewish, or many American Protestants say that they're Christian, but they're not really.
Right. So I'm going to ask you for a take, and based on that background, because I'm really interested in the ways that sort of
he's going to say Islamagoshism, dude. The mind of an American right winger that is like an intellectual version is so funny, because the intellectual version of the American right is Ross Douthat, right? And that is literally the perspective that he's about to describe here is like the average racist in France, okay, down the street. Because he is trying to intellectualize Islamagoshism, okay, Islamo-Marxism, Islamo-leftism. This is like the hot European bigoted sentiment. In America, we look at that as like an advanced version, an intellectual version, an intellectual man, a thinking man's way of saying Mohammedan.
Conservative forms of Islam and the culture of the progressive left right now fit together, both in Europe and the United States, because in a way, these are some of the most different groups you can imagine, right? Sort of forms of Islamic cultural traditionalism are pretty distant from the norms and mores of like the secular Western left, right? At the same time, including on some of the issues that you've been talking about, opposition to U.S. foreign policy, Israel, Palestine, and so on, there's a very strong alliance often between...
It's like the classic thing. It's like, yeah, these guys are barbaric. They don't abide by your worldview. Why do you want them to... why do you not want them to be genocided? And I do this thing where I was explaining to him like a worldview that I find morally repugnant or abhorrent that is not morally equivalent. I will use the KKK example here instead of Hamas. And then I also explain like, but this isn't obviously a perfect example. I'm just using the KKK as the most extreme position that I completely disagree with, right? Even those people I don't think should be firebombed and killed and genocided or whatever. But anyway, let's keep going.
Muslims who feel the U.S. is too imperialist or too pro-Israel, right? And these groups, and it's a pretty important force in European politics. And you see it, I think you see it more in progressive politics in the U.S. right now as sort of opposition to Israeli military operations.
Also, dismissing the progressive aspects of Muslims while calling them evil because of Islamagoshism. Yeah, if you're Muslim, automatically you're barbaric and evil and right-wing and backwards. Also, oftentimes the people that say that are literally evil and backwards and right-wing, which is really funny. It's something that I joke about all the time. Like, conservatives hate the conservatism of brown conservatives, right? Like, how many times have you heard, like, Ben Shapiro? Or even, like, Asmongold will do this sometimes. We'll be like, oh, they hate trans people over there, right? And it's like, but don't you also kind of hate trans people? Like, I don't understand. You don't want them in your video games? You make a big deal out of it all the time? Or not even Asmongold. Grums. Grums is a great example of this. He was celebrating that Saudi Arabia bought Electronic Arts. And he was like, finally, no more gays in video games. I'm like, dog, hello. Do you hear yourself? You're saying like, awesome. Now it's like the Saudi kingdom, which is perhaps the most like fundamentalist, long-standing form of monarchy, will now control the cultural output of this formerly beloved, not really, otherwise like Western enterprise, and you think it's like awesome. You're basically saying like, oh no, it's cool. Like I want the Taliban to own EA Sports. Like that's, or EA in general. Cause like that, I hate the gay people in the same way that like I think the Saudi government hates gay people. Is that the argument? Like that's what you're honestly saying? Okay, cool. Thank you for being honest, I guess.
It has become more and more of a litmus test.
Which, by the way, no one is going to, Saudi Arabia is not going to make, is not going to do an anti-woke initiative for EA. They don't give a, they just want to diversify their portfolio. People are so stupid.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you have thoughts on like how that fits together. These two very different, very culturally different groups having a kind of alliance of, is it alliance of convenience? Is it something more? What do you think about that?
Super easy to explain. I disagree vehemently with the Klan. I don't want Arkansas to be firebombed into oblivion. I don't want the children of Klans members to be killed at their schools. I don't want the hospitals that Klans members go to be bombed as well. And I'm not even making an equivocation between the Klan and, for example, Hamas, which I consider to be a resistance group. They have a emancipatory movement, ultimately. I don't agree with their internal politics, their domestic affairs. I don't agree with a lot of the things that they represent or a lot of the things that they say. But these are utterly inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, in the overarching hierarchy, where the number one most consequential wrong that's taking place is not only 78 plus years of brutal occupation and apartheid, but then also the ongoing genocide for the past 2 years. I feel like that is far more important to address than any number of different like civil liberty initiatives that Muslim countries could engage in. And I think a lot of people see it that way as well, where they're just like, I don't think this should be happening. I don't think that this violence should be happening. And we need to solve that first and foremost. It's not necessarily that leftists in the West are like firm and committed believers in, I don't know, whatever kind of like stereotype version of Islamic fundamentalism.
No, I don't. I don't think they are at all.
That people present.
No, I completely agree. That's I think a big part of why it's an interesting political formation, right? I'm going to run with the Klan analogy just because you offered it to me, right? Like, if there was a war against a small political state controlled by the KKK that followed in the aftermath of the KKK going out and killing a lot of African Americans, black women and children, and the larger region consisted of a bunch of regimes that, even if they weren't fully KKK, had some sort of white supremacist.
He thinks this is a gotcha, but it's not, and you'll see why.
Just, elements at all were authoritarian and so on, right? Like, I feel like a lot of people would see a little more complexity in that drama than you do in the way you talk about Israel and Zionism.
Yeah.
And I should say, I think opposition to and skepticism of the Israeli strategy in Gaza is totally understandable, and I've expressed it myself, right? But you're something more. Again, you're an anti-Zionist.
Yeah.
You've said, as long as we're doing KKK things in one of your arguments, you've said sort of, a certain kind of Zionist tendency should be treated the same way we treat neo-Nazi tendencies, right? And then that kind of rhetoric shows up around on the left.
These are my favorite moments. I know, like, in the New York Times circles, see, the other stuff, like Luigi Mangione, whatever, like, well, not Luigi Mangione, but like landlord stuff, like those sorts of things, the New York Times readers are going to be like, ooh, that's kind of scary, actually. But many of them are adults, and they're obviously completely aware of, like, what is taking place here because they're tuned into the goddamn New York Times. They know what Trump is up to. But these guys think that those statements are actually reflected on poorly by the audience. When the audience hears me say those things, his audience, New York Times readers, when they hear me say those things, they're going to be like, oh, I agree with everything that you just presented as like violent and negative commentary. The reality of the matter is, when he tries to present this as like, well, Zionists should be treated like the KKK, it's like, yeah, I agree, because they are. TVP 43, thank you for the 50, get the subs, by the way. 50 bomb.
Yeah.
Isn't there something a little bit strange from a left-wing perspective about that kind of focus on the crimes of one country?
Yeah, he was doing the why do you care so much about the Jewish state? I got to actually do like a full-blown debate with someone on Israel, because honestly, I think like I've dealt with all of this so many times that it's just like I really want to do it. Maybe Ben Shapiro. It could happen. Maybe in the month of January, it could happen.
That you've just yourself analogized to the KKK?
So, great question. The reason why I made certain to mention that I find the Klan's political opinions to be repugnant, but I still would not advocate to firebomb them, but then also made a distinction between Hamas as an emancipatory movement that has evolved over the years to fight back in ways that I might even personally find to be inappropriate or morally repugnant. Ultimately,
one or the other.
There is
more inappropriate or more morally repugnant.
I think that as someone who believes in human rights, I think like targeting civilians is the major reason why I criticize Israel. It would be very hypocritical if I considered targeting civilians to be appropriate if it was done during an emancipatory struggle. Having said that, I do have the same understanding or the same the same conceptualization of that kind of resistance as I do with the ANC or as I do with the IRA. Or even with the abolition of slavery in this country, right? The reason why I don't think it's an apt analogy to compare the KKK to Hamas beyond like disagreements and enforcement is because the Klan has not been dominated, or the Klan itself has not existed under a brutal structure of like black supremacy that wiped them out. This is the reason why I don't think the comparison is apt in that regard, because I do agree with Palestinian liberation as a concept, whereas I would liken the Klan's operations or their worldview to the same kind of ethno-religious supremacy that is baked into Zionism as well, and the exterminationist policies, I think, that also exist within Zionism as well. So the Klan is a closer analogy when it formalizes and it turns into a system of violence to what Israel is doing. This is why I'm also not shy about making comparisons to even Nazi Germany, which a lot of people, I think, maybe a couple of years ago, even myself, would shy away from doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think those comparisons are not really persuasive at all if you actually read about the things that the Nazis.
I have. This is where it gets a little bit more heated, because this is where he goes into New York Times mode, okay, where he's like, okay, burp, burp, must defend Israel.
Did on the Eastern Front and compare them to, whatever war crimes you accuse Israel of. Those comparisons seem pretty faulty to me. And they seem faulty in a way that, again, I think yields a kind of unique scapegoating of the Zionist state within the wider range of...
There's fundamentally no difference to a Klan cross burning in a black family's yard versus settlers spray painting a star in a Palestinian home. Of course. And that's just the settler violence, which is, again, backed by the state in the same way that the Klan was backed by the state as well, or at least the state was turning a blind eye to. I would go so far as to say that, no, actually, it's a great comparison, but we're not even talking about, when we're talking about Gaza, obviously, then the comparison goes away from the Klan to Nazi Germany. Anyway, let's see what he had. He said, accuse Israel of war crimes.
Middle Eastern states especially, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's, if you look at the history of the Middle East over the last 80 years, most of the crimes that you're accusing the Israeli government of committing if you look at the history of Iraq, if you look at what happened to the Jews in Arab countries after 1947 and 1948, if you're looking for, ruthless oppression, you can look next door to Egypt, right? Like, it seems like there are many, many potential targets of a leftist utopian form of moral outrage.
I've heard this so many times.
And
I wish this entire thing was about Israel, dude. I could talk about that for fucking hours. Also, this was like I think we talked for 2 hours, and this is an hour long, so hour and 14. So
right now, Israel is conducting a brutal war, and so I'm not saying I'm not. I agree. I agree with you that like right now it would be weird for you to go on your stream and say, let's not talk about Gaza. You know, let's talk about how the corruption of the Saudi monarchy. I agree with that. At the same,
which, by the way, I do talk about the Saudi monarchy quite a bit, or numerous other collaborative states far before even the Abraham Accords were implemented.
But you wouldn't describe yourself, right, as an I don't know what the right term is, but you wouldn't say like it's wrong for Saudi Arabia to exist because it was founded in some acts of violence, right?
But can I elaborate on that? I would say that it is utterly inappropriate and wrong if there were exclusionary practices, and some of this does exist in the Muslim states that we're talking about, where there was no allowance for example, Jews to come and live in these countries, right? And as a matter of fact,
oh no, this is like recent. So yeah, he still doesn't call it a genocide, even after the UN called it a genocide.
I'm pretty sure, speaking as a Christian, that there are some pretty exclusivist rules in more than a few Middle Eastern countries, right?
So absolutely, and I see that as a byproduct of the rampant destabilization that has existed in this resource-rich region. And my criticism against these countries not having the allowance or not having any moment of respite to be able to evolve, I see that as a byproduct of American imperialism and Western imperialism as well, because it makes it a lot more difficult for people to have any sort of civil rights struggle when they're so predisposed with being bombed or being destabilized in one way, shape, or form, either in the hands of Israel as a destabilizing factor in the region, or directly through American intervention, British intervention, and the like for coups and whatnot to take place in these countries. It makes it quite difficult for the regime change to take place in a revolutionary manner. And the Iranian Revolution also is a great example of this as well. When you put a puppet state in charge that is Western aligned, a lot of people, and that puppet state must enforce its dominance over and over again through brutal practices of torture and mass incarceration, people are inevitably going to revolt against that. And what I have seen in my experience as someone growing up in Turkey, more often than not, the people that actually find themselves the most earnest anti-Western figures, the people that these resentful populations can unite behind, oftentimes actually wear fundamentalism as a way to show how anti-Western they are. And this is the reason why some of these like despotic regimes actually end up taking power.
But you wouldn't extend, it seems to me like you wouldn't extend that kind of structural argument and narrative to the Israelis, right? You're like, well...
To a certain degree, I do, but Israel's the colonial power in this situation. So yes, there's a difference between victims of settler colonialism versus those who are doing settler colonialism. And there's certainly a difference between people who have experienced colonialism or war and the destabilizing nature of war itself, or even CIA intervention, like in the case with Iran, are obviously going to have revolutionary movements that are going to have fundamentalist leaders, because those are the earnest anti-Western figures. Israel is not a comparison that you can make with Iran, because Israel's fundamentalism is similar to America's fundamentalism, which I think I brought up here as well, where I talk about Israel growing in its hate because of its refusal to examine the inherent contradiction of the humanity of Palestinians that they always have to dehumanize and then forcibly excise from the land.
You know, there's so much. There's Western imperialism. You know, there's war. There's violence. This is how the Middle East, ends up with dictators and theocrats. Okay, the state of Israel has been surrounded by countries that deny its right to exist, have invaded it repeatedly, and
Israel was too busy killing Palestinians to have a civil rights evolution to respect Palestinians. I know, that's nuts.
I don't think, and yet that narrative to you does not inspire any sympathy.
Cringe Lord, thank you for the 50.
Because
yes
they're
and no.
winning, because they're currently winning.
It's incorrect to say that my analysis does not factor in like externalities or resistance against like Israel's incursions, for example. Ultimately, it goes back to, did the Palestinians have good reason to say we oppose this?
The war wouldn't have happened if Hamas commit mass murder. Hamas or ISIS. Can you not see that? And Ben Shapiro wouldn't waste his time on you knowing you're brainwashed to think Palestine are the divine. Well, I mentioned Ben Shapiro on purpose because he is going to waste his time on me. Exo Sophie, Exo. You can go back hundreds of years, and they always started their own wars with 5 Jewish countries. You know what's really funny about this, by the way? You know what's really funny about this? This is a damn near verbatim, identical argument against, like, Muslims that Nazis used against the Jews, dude. That's what's so crazy to me. Like, Nazis straight up took what anti-Jewish Nazis were saying about Jews and made it their own thing. This is literally verbatim the 109 countries narrative, bar for bar. That's what these stupid Zionist Nazi are doing. They don't even realize it. There's not even a shred of irony in this situation, okay? Not even a little bit of an irony. Like, you don't even understand it. You don't understand that you are literally a neo-Nazi, okay? How is this so difficult to comprehend? This is unironically the exact same thing that neo-Nazis say about Jews. You're saying that about Muslims. There's a reason why nobody wants the Palestinians. God damn. I feel like half of the people that were sitting in like Holocaust studies were taking notes to be like, this is the most scary shit I've ever heard. We got to make sure this never happens again. And then the other half was sitting there being like, well, that's pretty good. I think we can use this one. Like, what the is this? What happened? Jesus Christ. They dusted off old recipes, man.
Opposed the Israeli state. Was it born out of ancient anti-Semitism?
Check her reply bar for bar. What'd she say? What'd that dumbass say? It's facts, nothing Nazi about it. Yes, Nazis say that about Jews, dumbass. And when they're called out for it, they turn around and say the exact same thing. You're so stupid. God damn. That's just fascism. That's just fascism. There's no better description that this is a fascist ideology than this exact conversation that just took place.
Or was it born out of an emancipatory need that all indigenous people have, all peoples of the world have, in terms of developing autonomy?
Well, it could have been,
argument
but it
that Israel makes for its own Jewish determination, right? A Jewish state's self-determination,
But surely it could be both, right? You could say, of course, there's an admirable, understandable desire for emancipation, a desire to have your own homeland. But at the same time, at a certain point, when it hits, a certain level of, KKK style hatred, you would say, even if the original motivation is correct, even if there are understandable motivations here, something has gone wrong.
That's precisely the reason why it invokes a violent reaction, though. But ultimately, that is what Zionism ends up becoming. And
like, he doesn't understand. I think he's talking about KKK style when talking about Hamas, and I'm talking about Israel. That's why I was like, yeah, you're right. Of course the KKK style hatred is going to invoke some kind of violent resistance. And I'm like, no, that's why Hamas is resisting violently.
If left unaddressed, this inherent contradiction, this notion that of Jewish...
Like, he doesn't understand that the comparison is more apt when we're talking about like KKK versus Israel. The comparison is more apt for Israel instead of Hamas.
Self-determination is presented as like a totally normal thing. Everybody has self-determination. People have a right to develop their own nation state, but this one specifically has demographic concerns that require the eradication or the mass displacement of the indigenous population that do not fit the in-group, the demographic in-group.
Come on, tell me that's not a cookening, though, for like liberals. I mean, yeah, everybody has a right to self-determination, but you can't do that by being like, my self-determination requires me to be an ethno-state. Sorry. That's a cookening, all right?
And that is at the heart of this problem of how certain societies get more and more comfortable with fascist violence.
All right,
I see this as a dual problem in America as well as Israel.
So let's just take that, because I know you have to go stream. This is the last.
I mean, I could talk about this all day, by the way, especially on the New York Times. I mean, this is not.
I'm sure you will be talking about it all day. Some of us.
I told the facts, the history of brainwash to think different is facts. Dude, check it. You and your followers are in a woke world that will make you see. What are you talking about? Like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Dude, you literally said Palestinians are getting kicked out all the time. Arabs are the ones who always start the wars. And you're straight up using Nazi rhetoric when talking about Jews, okay? Like, this is what Nazis say about Jews. If that's not enough for you, I don't know what else to say. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're just straight up wrong. Okay? Jewish people were not, or Jewish people were there. 2% of the population in Palestine was Jewish, but Jewish people did not like materialize there. And then all of a sudden, everyone was like, whoa, what? Like, we have to purge the Jews because we're anti-Semitic. Like, that's not how this happened, okay? It was a settler colonial occupation deliberately designed to slowly but surely, through a process of aliyahs, through a process of immigration initially, pilgrimages, okay? In the same way that, like, the early colonists did in the United States of America, came in and caused a lot of chaos. The indigenous population understandably resisted against it. There were riots and protests and whatnot. Some of that even turned bloody and deadly. But ultimately, the colonial power pulled back, and the Zionist brigades took over and mass slaughtered and then ethnically cleansed. It seems like about 75% of the comments like you and about 25% don't. Yeah. Anyway, ethnically cleansed the Palestinians. Oh, God, I can't believe we're doing this. Too scared to read the whole thing. 99% of the population think the way I do. Dude, you are literally straight up. No one agrees with you. The overwhelming majority of the population is anti-Israel, and a scary percentage of the population is now also anti-Semitic as well. They're not even just anti-Israel. They are unimaginably anti-Semitic too. And a lot of dumb, I don't even know where they exist, but they just straight up think that that's not the case. Defo in Israel, and in that case, she's right. Yeah, the only place on the planet where that position is the majority position is Israel. That's it.
Some of us, though, don't have the same stamina. So I'm just going to ask a last question off that point, right? You're talking about parallels between the Israeli situation and the U.S. situation. You know, you're talking about, the idea that the Israeli situation represents fascism facing resistance. The U.S. situation, obviously, lots of people on the left consider Trump a fascist. This is a very dark narrative. And one of my recurring sort of themes over the last month has been watching the left as an outsider and seeing it go dark, in effect, get really, really pessimistic. So I want to ask you about that, about nihilism and despair. You have a worldview, that has a very bleak.
Bro, hit the NVE talking points, by the way. Like, even the nihilism. The last point is like, even the nihilism. Like, if I was transgender, he'd be calling the authorities. You know what I mean? It's like dangerous, violent rhetoric, anti-capitalist sentiment, anti-American sentiment, anti-Israel sentiment. Like, this is straight up like the last thing that I don't have, which we didn't get into, was like the dangerous gender rhetoric, extremist rhetoric around gender. And if he had hit that one too, because nihilism he's talking about too. Wait, he deadass thinks you have a nihilistic worldview? No, I don't think he thinks I'm a nihilist. I don't think he thinks that. I think he's just asking that question because there is a lot of nihilism out there.
Of the U.S. empire as a global force.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay, so tell me why you're optimistic. Let's end there.
Yes. So what I constantly, and I see this as well, I think nihilism is a major problem in the increasingly alienated, increasingly isolated, permanently online generations that are born into a universe where they just have an iPad in front of them from the start, right? And that nihilism is born out of our lack of our inability to make changes, meaningful changes in the system. One example I will use is like the Black Lives Matter protest that took place. Black Lives Matter protest took place. A lot of people in the aftermath of these lockdowns were very frustrated. They saw something that was so patently unjust, and they wanted to make demands. They did all of the right things. They protested. Some of those protests actually with police intervention in some instances turned even violent, right? Many people were arrested as a consequence of this, but the broad majority of the protests were started off peacefully, and the argument was perfectly reasonable. We have to do something about the unfair practice of policing in black and brown neighborhoods, and the systemic racism that exists within the criminal justice system. And it's an argument that I also, of course, agree with. Now, after that, they also then turned around and voted. They voted for the Democratic Party. Joe Biden won over Donald Trump. There was a period of celebration, but no change actually came. The same structures of oppression existed, and the Democrats actually presented an alternative. They spent most of their time criticizing the activist-born defund the police movement without trying to understand exactly what that meant. Basically, for the political normie, they did everything by the book. And no.
Blake Neff, this doubt that Hasan Piker interview is deranged. Look, I'll just summarize it. The structural violence of equity. Yeah, that's the kind of term you hear 10 minutes before a commissar shoots you in the head. Okay, dude, keep fantasizing. Okay, producer for the Charlie Kirk show. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? What am I supposed to do with this? Like, that's just your fantasy. Okay? You have derived a fantastical narrative, a hysterical narrative off of this conversation. That's not my fault. Like, how am I supposed to literally be like, well, I guess you have a sincere fear here. Go ahead, sir. Lock me up. Like, what do you mean? When I'm talking about violence, it's an abstract concept, so I don't go to jail. Okay, dude.
No change came. What do you expect in the aftermath of that but nihilism? But my solution to that has always been to maintain revolutionary optimism. I tell people not to succumb to nihilism all the time. I tell people to maintain revolutionary optimism. And the reason why I say that is because I myself understand how change takes place, how long it takes for actual systemic change, seismic shifts to take place in society, even in a democratic one that maybe is a theoretical democracy but doesn't actually abide by the democratic wishes of the majority. I know that these things take time. And one thing that I have seen that has given me tremendous confidence has been the attitude, the societal attitude on the issue of Israel. I think the sheer brutality of Israel's conquest over the Palestinians, what I and the international community now recognizes as a genocide, has, I think, made people, in spite of the media sanitation, made people reflect on that and made people recognize the truth. So that actually gives me a little bit of hope that I think people do have the capacity to see exactly what's going on and have the capacity to recognize right from wrong and to demand change, no matter how impossible said change feels.
Hasan Piker, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
I gotta talk to Ezra, bro. That's what I gotta do. I gotta talk to Ezra. Give me Ezra. I'm going after all the New York Times guys one by one.